nature isn't your friend. It doesn't care if you live or die. But sometimes, the things hiding in the wilderness, they care very much. Imagine being stuck on a cliff edge, running from something that looked human but moved like an animal. Imagine finding a cooking pot deep in a cave, only to realize the residue inside matches your own DNA. Imagine realizing the person you love, the person standing right next to you on a lonely trail, is a murderer who just confessed. The woods are deep, the mountains are high, and nobody can hear you scream. Welcome to the True Haunting Log podcast. I am your host, and today we are trekking into the unknown. We are leaving the safety of the city lights and heading into the Rockies, the deep woods, and the forgotten mines where history and horror refuse to die. These are the logs of the survivors. Sit back, close your eyes, and let the darkness take over. Story 1: The Impossible Climb. For almost 2 decades now, I've worked as a helicopter pilot for Utah's Department of Public Safety. People are often surprised by what a varied job it actually is. You see, while we obviously provide a lot of support to law enforcement chasing bad guys, surveillance, that sort of thing, we also perform medical evacuations, assist with wildfire, and disaster response. But most relevant to my story today, we support search and rescue operations out in the Rockies. I'm on call too, 4 hours a day, 7 days a week. So sometimes I'm grabbing my gear in the middle of dinner. Sometimes it's in the middle of the night, dragging myself out of a warm bed because someone's gotten themselves into trouble in the UWC. That's the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, about 30 miles east of Salt Lake City. Most of the time, the calls come from hikers or climbers who get lost or hurt in the mountains. Or sometimes we get skiers caught in avalanches during the brutal winters. Those are tragic, sure, but they are understandable. Nature is harsh. But then, other times, I find myself flying into situations that are much more unsettling than just a lost hiker or a stranded skier. Situations that defy logic. The bird I fly most is the Airbus H-125. It's a single-engine helicopter that's ideal for flying through the Rockies. It's got enough power for high-altitude work, which is crucial around here since elevations can regularly push 10,000 feet or more during search and rescue operations. I take off from the airport in Salt Lake, and then, within minutes, I'm soaring up into the mountains to link up with the ground team. The air gets thin quick up there. You've got to manage your power carefully. The H-125 handles it well, but it can sometimes feel very different from flying at sea level. The controls feel a little mushy. The engine has to work harder. It's beautiful up there in the mountains, don't get me wrong. But the weather can turn on a dime. One minute, it's clear blue skies. The next, you're dealing with turbulence from downdrafts off the peaks, or snowstorms that come out of nowhere and cut visibility down to absolutely nothing. But even when the weather's fine, the kind of flying we have to do up there can get really dangerous, really quick. On more than one occasion, I've had to hover in tight spots, like above a narrow ridge with my rotors less than 20 feet or so from the treetops. I then have to hold that position on pain of death. Literally. If I drift, we crash. I have to hold it steady while the crew lowers the hoist to a stranded climber with a busted leg. Those hoists really come in handy for pulling people out of tough spots like steep canyons or cliffs where you can't land. But they're not a fix-all. To fill the gaps, my crew and I keep the bird loaded up with specialized gear. Night vision goggles for when the sun goes down, high-intensity searchlights, and reco detectors. A reco detector is a real handy piece of equipment which can pinpoint people wearing reflective clothing or specialized tags. Because flying SAR missions search and rescue in the Utah Rockies is no joke. We need all the help we can get out there. And despite all I've said, most ops are actually pretty straightforward in terms of what we do. We spot them. We drop a line. We haul them off the mountain. Then we crack a beer back at HQ and call it a day. But there's one mission from a couple of years back that still has me wondering, what in the world really happened out there? It started just like any other call might do. A phone ringing on my nightstand, dragging me out of a deep sleep. The red numbers on the clock glaring at me in the dark. The missing man's wife had called 911 just a few hours before. Her husband had failed to return home following a solo hike up near Hayden Peak. I wasn't expecting anything too intense. The last couple of ops involved rescuing pencil-pushing city boys who'd bitten off more than they could chew. Weekend warriors who twisted an ankle. So I figured it might be more of the same. We geared up. We took off. But after flying over the area surrounding Farm Creek Peak, the area he was supposed to be in, we couldn't spot our hiker anywhere. The ground team was already on location. I could see them down below, tiny specks combing the trails on ATVs. But they were coming up empty. So, we decided to open up our search area. We expanded the grid. We pushed further out to see what we could find. Eventually, we found ourselves flying over a place called Wilson's Peak. This is the highest point in the entire state of Utah. And let me tell you, the terrain up there is brutal. Sheer cliffs, deep snowpack that never really melts, jagged rocks that look like teeth. And since it was a long way off the area our hiker was said to be, we didn't expect to find anything. We were just being thorough. But no sooner had we gotten close enough. My co-pilot spotted something through the thermal imaging camera. It was weak. A faint orange glow on the screen. But it was damn sure human-shaped. And it was up on a narrow bluff about 8,000 feet up. I banked us closer, eyes peeled on the spot. And then suddenly, there he was. The missing hiker. He was sitting near a ledge. No tent, no pack, just him in a thin jacket. He was limply waving one arm at us, looking like he'd been through absolute hell. I radioed the ground teams immediately. "We have a visual," I said. I passed on the man's coordinates. The ground team acknowledged and then sent ATVs in our direction. But I watched them from the air. I saw them hit the base of the incline and stop. After a tense 20 minutes of them probing the approaches, the leads came back over the radio. Their voice was crackly, frustrated. "The approach is iced over," they said. "It's far too steep. We can't get the ATVs up there." To get to the guy without putting the chopper in danger, they'd need specialists with climbing gear. Ropes, crampons, the works. That would take around 2 hours to organize and hike up. The trouble was, from the looks of him, I didn't think the guy had 2 hours left. He wasn't moving much. The cold was eating him alive. I looked at my co-pilot. He looked at me. We didn't need to say much. We both agreed. "Screw it," I said. "We're going in low, drop the line." And to say it was a risky move would be one heck of an understatement. Regulations say to keep a buffer for wind shear and rotor wash. But I dipped the nose and threaded the chopper between pine trees and the jagged contour of the slope. The altimeter started yelling warnings at me. "Pull up, pull up." I ignored it. We got within 50 feet of the bluff. That is dangerously low for a winch operation in such gusty conditions. One wrong gust of wind, and we slam into the mountainside. My winch medic is a guy named Tony Reyes. Guy has balls of steel. He clipped the winch to his rig, opened the door, and lowered himself onto the cable as I hovered in place. He edged across the ledge towards our missing hiker. The wind was swinging him around, but he stayed focused. Once he reached him, Ray asked the guy if he was strong enough to hold on to something. The guy couldn't stand. He was frozen stiff. But Ray managed to get the very unglamorously named crotch strap between his legs. And then, with a little assistance, he was secured. We couldn't linger. Fuel was burning, and the winds were picking up. The mountain didn't want us there. I spotted a flat meadow a mile down the valley. It looked clear and flat enough to safely set down. My co-pilot pulled the line up a little. Up came Ray and our hiker, dangling beneath the skids. And then off we went. I gently dropped them off in the meadow before I set the bird down nearby to wait for the ground crew. Once our rotors were still, my co-pilot and I hopped out to go check on the hiker. We found him propped up against a log, wrapped in foil blankets, while Ray set up an IV to get some warm fluids into him. But something was off. Our hiker had been missing for less than 24 hours. But he looked gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days. His face was sunken. He was dehydrated to the point that his tongue was a little swollen, and he had trouble speaking. Even stranger, the guy couldn't seem to remember his own name. Not at first, anyway. Now, hypothermia makes people slow. It makes them sluggish. But it doesn't typically fog their memory like total amnesia. This guy was all glassy-eyed and confused when we asked his name. He didn't say it. We could tell that he genuinely couldn't remember who he was. And then, after maybe a minute or two, it seemed to just come back to him. Like recalling the phone number of an old girlfriend or something. Just a sudden snap of recognition. I remember kneeling next to him. I put a hand on his shoulder. "Hey buddy," I asked. "What happened? How did you end up all the way up there?" He broke eye contact immediately. He stared off into the trees, kind of blinking for a second, like he was seeing something we couldn't see. Then he said he couldn't remember. The only things he did remember were hiking alone, realizing someone was following him, and then running to try and escape them. Then, the next thing he knew, he was way up the side of the mountain, too exhausted to climb back down again. That was it. No significant details to go on. No description of who was following him. No coherent timeline. Just, he was alone, he got scared, and then he ran in a blind panic till he came to again on a cliff edge. The ground team rolled up on their ATVs within maybe 10 to 15 minutes. The medics began swarming the guy. We waited for Ray to finish talking to the ground team lead, hoping that the guy would get more talkative as he warmed up. But he didn't. His memory stayed foggy. We never found out how a guy with no climbing equipment climbed all the way up to that bluff. The paramedics chalked it up to exposure or delirium. They said missing hikers often try to climb up high so aircraft can spot them. They don't anticipate the nights getting fatally cold. So after they loaded him up, they took him off to the ER in Provo for treatment. They said it would all make sense once the guy's memory came back to him. We wrapped the op. We flew back to base. We did the debrief with all the standard paperwork. Now, we had done our job. maybe even saved a guy's life in the process. So it should have been high fives all around. We should have hit the bar for celebration beers. But all we did was sit around the hangar talking about it, because none of it made any sense. Think about it. The bluff near Wilson's Peak was almost a day's walk from Hayden, the place the guy was reported missing. That meant that he'd hiked and climbed over 15 miles as the crow flies to get from Hayden to Wilson. And if you know the terrain, that seems next to impossible. Especially at night. Especially in the snow. And then, to get up the bluff that he was on, he must have truly believed that his life was in danger. Because, I don't know if you're a climber, or if any climbers are actually listening, but I'm talking Class 5 scrambling against vertical faces. That is something any usual amateur would consider themselves incapable of. It requires gear, ropes, skill. Now, this guy had no climbing gear, no experience listed in his profile. The family confirmed that he was a casual weekend walker from the flatlands. So in that case, how the heck did he free climb that? In a panic? In the snow? Without breaking his own damn neck? Investigators followed up on his claims of a pursuit, but they didn't find a second set of tracks on the snow below. And there were no reports of suspicious activity from any place in the park. The guy recovered physically. He was happily reunited with his wife and kids following a brief stay in the hospital. But his memories stayed like Swiss cheese. The last thing he recalled clearly was realizing that he was being followed. And then, apart from a few flashes of running, climbing, and fearing for his life, it was all dark patches. In the years since, I must have gone over it in my head maybe 100 times already. And I wonder what spooked the guy so bad that he actually turned into a damn mountain goat. The only thing that really tracks is a bear. A big old black bear standing on 2 legs, which might have started chasing him on 4. That's the only sight that I could figure would trigger that kind of primal, adrenaline-fueled fear that lets a man do the impossible. In which case, it could have been a mama bear just taking care of her cubs. But then, what if it wasn't? What if it really was a man out there, lurking among the trees, waiting for some hapless hiker to come along so he could hunt them through the trees? I mean, let me know what you think. Both are scary in their own way. But it still doesn't explain the distances involved, or how our hiker climbed up that bluff. And it kills me thinking I'll never find out, and it will forever remain a mystery of the mountains. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from the wild. It's the fear of the unknown, the fear of predators. But usually, when we go into the woods, we bring someone with us. A partner, a friend, someone to watch our back. But what happens when the danger isn't in the trees? What happens when the danger is the person holding your hand? What happens when the person you trust with your life is the one you need to run from? Story 2, The Proposal. When I was 28 years old, I was still living in Denver. I remember this one night vividly. A few friends and I went out for dinner and drinks. It was fun at first, but as the sun went down and the alcohol started to flow, I realized that I just wasn't feeling it. I had really gotten into yoga, running, and eating healthy that summer. So, even though staying out late and partying was still fun in theory, I just didn't have the energy for it anymore. I felt out of place. I stayed for one last drink before saying goodbye to my friends. I walked outside into the cool night air to catch a cab. And then, as I was waiting on the curb, I heard a man's voice off to the right of me. "Are you waiting for a cab too?" And that is how I met Patrick. Turns out we were in very similar situations. He'd been out celebrating his brother's birthday, but he had quit drinking a few years back. So before everyone got too drunk and too annoying, he figured that he'd head home to save himself the headache. Now, I liked the idea of a guy who didn't drink. It showed maturity. So after establishing that we were both single and of similar ages, I began to drop some not-so-subtle hints that he should ask for my number. We were having such fun flirting that we almost didn't notice when an empty cab drove right past us. And then, when the next one came around, Patrick insisted that I be the one to take it. He was a gentleman. He was handsome. And he was charming. So when he texted me about grabbing some coffee sometime, you can bet that I texted back immediately. We dated for 2 years, and I fell deeply in love with him. He was the ideal partner, except for one tiny peccadillo: his past. Now, I know in literally any other circumstance, a guy not being frank about his history is a huge red flag. But Patrick wasn't entirely opaque. He talked about high school. He talked about climbing the career ladder in his 20 seconds. He was willing to be frank about past relationships, too. The only thing he wasn't so open about was college. He said his first 2 years were basically non-stop partying. He said it got so bad that he had to repeat a few courses during his sophomore year. He talked about falling in with a pretty bad crowd and how he had to cut himself off from them just to get his degree. I could tell that he was embarrassed, maybe even a little ashamed. So I didn't push him on it. I just liked that he'd changed. I loved the man he was now. And then one day, Patrick asked me to go hiking with him. Now, I was surprised because Patrick was just about the least outdoorsy type of guy you could imagine. He worked out, sure, but he loved the indoor gym. He was way more interested in gadgets and tech than the natural world. So, when he asked me if I wanted to go hiking, of all things, I was actually kind of stunned. But I was super excited. You see, maybe 6 months prior, we'd been talking about the prospect of getting married, even having children. Not specifically planning it, but talking in general terms. Patrick had asked what my ideal proposal location would be. He gave me examples like the bridge in Central Park or the top of the Eiffel Tower. But after considering it, I decided I'd much rather be proposed to in a place of natural beauty rather than somewhere artificial. I remember he nodded like, "Okay, unconventional, I like it." But I never thought in a million years he'd actually keep it in mind. So that Sunday morning when he asked if I wanted to go hiking up near Golden Gate Park that following weekend, it dawned on me. Patrick was planning on proposing. I started freaking out in text messages to friends saying that I didn't know if I was ready. I mean, I wanted to marry him. I just didn't know what kind of wife I was going to be or if our relationship would survive the transition from casual to serious commitment. My friends said that I was just overthinking things. They told me to trust that initial gut feeling of excitement. And it was true. Realizing a proposal was on the cards had made me so very happy. So, rather than continue to ruminate, I just simply waited for the date of the hiking trip. And when it came, I just knew that I was going to say yes. The first 2 hours or so were just a dream. My usually outdoors-averse boyfriend had put a ton of effort into making sure that he had all the right equipment. And being his typical self, he brought a bunch of cool gadgets along too. Stuff like straws with built-in water filters and solar-powered phone chargers, just in case we got low on battery. The scenery was beautiful. The weather in the Rockies was great. And as Patrick guided us along the trails towards our mystery destination, I got more and more excited. And before long, he took us up a trail that wound up a very steep slope. When we got to the top, we found ourselves at a sort of steep earthen cliff that overlooked the forest below. It was an incredible view. Just miles of green trees and silence. Knowing what was coming, I started to get a little emotional. My heart was pounding in my chest. Patrick looked at me, smiling as I wiped away the tears. He said, "You know what I'm going to ask you, right?" I just laughed and said, "Yes." I expected him to drop to one knee and produce a ring at any moment. I was ready for the happiest moment of my life. But he didn't drop to one knee. Instead, Patrick started explaining how he had brought me all the way out there to propose. But there was just something he needed to tell me first. Right away, I got nervous. The air shifted. Patrick could sense it. I thought he'd try and reassure me that it wasn't anything too serious. Maybe he had debt. Maybe he had been married before. But he didn't. He just stayed quiet until I finally said, "Well, what is it?" He asked me if I loved him. He asked if I trusted him. When I answered yes, he didn't seem any more sure of himself. He asked if I could keep a secret. If I could keep the most important secret of his whole life. And again, God help me. I said yes. Patrick began telling me a story. He told me how, during his second year of college, he and his frat buddies went to an off-campus party. Some kind of warehouse rave type of deal. He said this was when he and his friends were at their very worst behavior. Drinking like fish. Fighting like sailors. Causing trouble for anyone and everyone. At this party, he started flirting with a girl. They headed off someplace quiet to make out. Patrick said that they made out for a while, and then the girl said something like, "Come back inside and dance with me." But after he returned from the bar with drinks, the girl was gone. He went looking all over for her, but couldn't find her anywhere. Then, when he spotted her, maybe a half hour later, she was completely obliterated. Patrick said that he didn't know if it was liquor. It was something else. Like roofies. The girl seemed on the verge of passing out. He tried to get her back to the frat house. But when she was just about conscious enough to object, Patrick didn't want to go home empty-handed. He did look and sound like he was ashamed of himself as he said it. But Patrick admitted to taking the semi-conscious girl to some dark corner of the warehouse compound and doing stuff to her. I guess the look of disgust on my face was plain to see, because he frantically added that this was the single biggest regret of his entire life. He explained how he wasn't that guy anymore, how it made him afraid to have daughters, knowing certain kinds of men harbor some predatory instincts. He said it was a long time ago, that he'd lived with a regret ever since. And I thought that was it. I thought that was the secret. That he had assaulted someone in college. It was only after a minute or two of just sort of processing it, feeling sick to my stomach, that I asked if he'd ever tried to find the girl and make amends for what he'd done. And that's when I realized that this story wasn't over. Patrick said that when he was done, he left the girl lying there where she was. She was passed out completely by then, but all he gave a crap about was going back inside to get a drink because he was thirsty. He knew how selfish it was. She could have been overdosing. She could have choked on her own puke. But Patrick said it was a full hour before it occurred to him to go back and check on her. He said he asked his friends not to leave till he got back. He went out expecting to find the girl sleeping, as he put it. And yet when he got there, he found that not only was the girl awake, she was somewhat more sober than before, and she remembered what he'd done to her. She was obviously livid. She told Patrick that she was going to go to the cops. She wasn't about to let some piece of crap frat boy get away with treating her like that. I felt proud of her, and I didn't even know her. Then Patrick said something that made my blood run cold. He described how he snapped. He said he pictured his whole life unraveling, how life after prison wouldn't be worth living. He had the world at his feet, but that girl was about to yank the carpet out from under him. And he couldn't let that happen. When Patrick finally uttered the words to me, I didn't mean to kill her. I felt my entire world crumbling around me. It was like this out-of-body experience, watching myself from afar while my heart broke in my chest. Not just for me, in the life I thought I was going to have. I was heartbroken for that poor girl. Just trying to do the right thing, protecting his future, resulted in Patrick accidentally crushing her larynx. He said he just wanted to scare her at first, make the problem go away. But all that fear had him squeezing just a little too hard. Patrick didn't realize just how much damage he was doing until he felt the girl's throat just sort of give way in his hands. He said her eyes went all wide as she tried to get air into her lungs, but she couldn't. And then maybe a minute or two later, she was dead. Patrick said he could have run for help, but he didn't, because he was scared. Instead, once he was sure that the girl was dead, Patrick went back inside the warehouse party. He asked his closest friend in the frat for one hell of a favor. It was one he granted. And then over the next couple of hours, they managed to hide the girl's body somewhere no one would ever find it. Patrick never said exactly where, but he kind of hinted it was some kind of state park or forest. At which point, it suddenly made sense why he hated the idea of hiking. He told me he was sorry, deeply and truly sorry, that he'd do anything to take back his mistake. But he also said it was a mistake committed by his old self, his younger self. And he didn't think that it was one of his new self he had to pay for. Patrick then looked me in the eyes, and he asked me if I thought that was a reasonable thing to say. And I suddenly realized just how vulnerable I really was. Look where we were. We were miles from the car, on a cliff edge, alone. If I said no, if I said that I thought he was a murdering piece of crap and I didn't want to marry him, what was to stop him from silencing me, too? He could just shove me down the steep slope, bash my head in at the bottom to finish me off. No one might ever find me. I'd end up just like that girl. A face on a missing poster. My family was wondering what the hell had happened to me. Deep down, knowing that I was gone if I panicked, I knew I couldn't reject him. I knew I had to at least act as I understood. And so I underwent one of the most painfully surreal experiences of my entire life. I pretended to be the loving fiancé of a murderer, someone who violates people. I told him I agreed that the new him shouldn't have to pay for his old crimes. I told him I wasn't about to let one shot at happiness slip through my fingers because some skank decided to run her mouth. I'm ashamed to say that I said that. I feel dirty just thinking about it. But it's true. I'd have said just about anything to get out of that forest alive. I figured what I planned on really doing would justify it. I leaned into the morbid curiosity that I felt. I asked if he was scared that the girl's body would end up being found. And more importantly, what was going to happen to us if he ended up getting caught? Colorado had the death penalty at the time. So, as Patrick said, if he got caught, it was over for us. We talked about the prospect of dating again after one of us passes away. Like I said, it was surreal in the extreme. But, and this is probably going to sound insane, I felt safe with him in that moment. Because I thought I had him. I thought I had tricked him. After our hike was done, we walked back to his car. Every step was terrifying. Walking in front of him on the narrow trail. Waiting for the shove. Waiting for the blow to the back of the head. But it never came. When we got to the car, I felt this rush of almost victory, knowing that I'd survived. All I had to do was sort of keep the act up till I could get home and call the cops. But before I could do that, all the pretending I'd done resulted in a state of almost complete nervous collapse. After getting home, I think I cried for a straight hour. Then I called my mom and cried for another hour on top of that. It was probably the worst day of my life, hands down. Catastrophic mental trauma. But then, once I was done crying, I pulled myself together. I hung up on Mom. And then I called 911. I packed an overnight bag as I waited for them to arrive. I planned on staying with my mom for the foreseeable future after Patrick got arrested. I was scared that they'd maybe let him go for some reason. Lack of evidence. Bail. But it turned out that I didn't have to worry about anything like that. Because when the cops showed up at his place looking to talk with him, he was nowhere to be found. I talked to the Denver PD a lot in the weeks that followed. I also ended up getting a call from 2 detectives in Arizona where Patrick went to college. They were very interested in his story because the location of the murder, along with the timing of the girl's disposal, made it easier to figure out where to look. I then also got a call from an FBI agent. He asked if Patrick ever went by another name, or if he ever mentioned owning a fake passport. I said no to both questions. The agent never came out and said it, but it was kind of obvious that they thought Patrick had fled the country somehow. They just didn't know how or where he'd gone. Then the agent asked if there was anywhere in the world that I thought he might have gone. Somewhere special that he might have mentioned wanting to visit. I told them about Patrick mentioning Paris and Rome one time. But aside from that, he never seemed all that interested in traveling. To this day, he's never been found. But I still hold out hope that he'll show up somewhere one day. That he'll finally have to pay for what he did to that poor girl. That's almost my ideal scenario. I open the newspaper one day and there's Patrick's face under the headline saying something like, "Fugitive apprehended overseas." But my nightmare scenario goes a little something like this. One day, and maybe even someday soon, I'm sitting home alone. There's a knock at my door. I go to open it. I'm so comfortable and confident that I don't bother checking the peephole. And then when I open it, there he is. There's Patrick. And he's come to shut me up for good. We leave things behind when we die. Sometimes it's memories. Sometimes it's secrets. But sometimes, whole towns are left behind. Rotten wood, rusted metal, and the echoes of violence that soaked into the very soil. You can walk through a ghost town and feel the eyes of the past watching you. But be careful what stories you dig up, because some ghosts don't want to be found. Story 3: The Ghost Town Massacre. You probably would never think it to look at me today. These days, I make a living fixing cars and motorcycles. Grease under the fingernails, radio playing in the shop. But this life is built partly on the back of skills that I picked up in my former life, as the guitarist in a touring rock and roll band. Now, we never made it big or anything. We didn't sell out stadiums or earn a platinum record. But we made enough money selling tapes and t-shirts and tickets to our shows to earn a pretty decent living for ourselves. We were based out of Boston. We played a lot of shows in New York and Philly, but we also played all over the country too. We did that old school touring schedule thing, planning a conquest with nothing but a folded roadmap and a phone book. And that's how we ended up doing a kind of Rocky Mountain rock and roll tour during the summer of 1977. One that took us through Utah, Wyoming, and most relevant to this story, Colorado. We managed to book ourselves onto the bill of a music festival in a little mountain town called Lake City. It was a bit of a family affair. So we played a couple of Gordon Lightfoot and Neil Diamond numbers along with a couple of our softer tunes. It was light duty, as my World War II vet dad used to say. We were still working, but it was also a chance to relax and recharge our batteries a little before the heavier shows up in Aspen and Boulder, and Denver started. We finished our set at around 5:30. Then we walked around talking to the locals and enjoying their hospitality. I had myself a little green chili bison burger, a delicacy that no other burger has managed to top, by the way. While our bassist, this crazy S.O.B., ate a whole plate of Rocky Mountain oysters all to himself, much to the amusement of the locals. And if you don't know what those are, boy, do I envy you. One of the folks we got to talking to was a man named Jed. He was particularly pleased with us, thanks to our cover of If You Could Read My Mind, which he said was his and his wife's song. We got to talking about some of the other music we like to play. And at the mention of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, he joked about us being a band of traveling Satanists. He knew all the panic surrounding metal was bullcrap. He remembered when the release of Psycho back in 1960 had folks saying society was, quote-unquote, going to hell. He even said he took his teenage son to see Carrie during Thanksgiving weekend of that previous year. So, as a huge fan of Stephen King, we quickly established a mutual love of all things creepy. Maybe an hour or two later, Jed said that he had to jet. But before he did, he asked if we'd be interested in seeing a genuine ghost town named Carson before we left for our next stop. Now, we were pretty thrilled at the idea. Doing cool stuff like that was half the reason we went on tour in the first place. We didn't just get to play shows and make money. We got to see America, too. And I'd say that there were a few things all 5 band members could get excited about, like the idea of seeing a real-life ghost town. We met up with Jed bright and early the next morning. We followed his car up a bunch of gravelly mountain tracks until we eventually reached a dead end. Jed apologized and said that we'd have to walk about a mile up the mountain to get to Carson. But we didn't mind at all. It was actually kind of nice to be able to stretch our legs after spending so long on the tour bus. After a short walk through a whole bunch of trees, we entered a clearing. There were around a dozen wooden buildings, all standing derelict. Gray wood, sagging roofs, windows staring out like empty eye sockets. Jed told us that Carson was founded back in 1889 as a silver mining settlement. For a few years, It was home to almost 500 miners as well as around half a dozen families who sold them food and equipment and laundry services. The town prospered for a few years. They built extra bunkhouses to accommodate even more miners. But by 1895, not a single soul remained. Carson had been completely abandoned. When we asked what happened, Jed told us that there were two explanations: the official one and the unofficial one. The official one had been propagated by the town's owner and financier. He tried selling the land because the silver mine had supposedly run dry. But the unofficial explanation, which Jed says was the God's truth, had been passed by word of mouth from generation to generation. And this one was considerably creepier. Jed said that he'd heard the tale from his grandfather. His grandfather had heard it from a lady who used to live up in Carson with her family. Jed's grandfather was a deputy sheriff, a man who could smell a lie the way other men could smell pie baking in an oven. And his grandpa believed every single word that lady had to say. He hadn't just heard it from her either. He said he met a handful of others who claimed to have been there that day. Some said a riot erupted up there in the mine, that the company's armed guards had to step in to put it down with lead. But the girl Jed's grandfather spoke to, her pa had actually gone up to the mine and seen the aftermath with his own two eyes. He said it wasn't just some minor strike that turned violent. It had been an all-out slaughter. Every man for himself. The folks in Carson realized what was going on when a couple of wounded miners came running into town. They'd already heard gunshots echoing down the mountainside. But seeing as they relied on hunters and trappers for all their fresh meat, they didn't think much of it at first. But when those first miners came running into town, covered in cuts and stab wounds and riddled with buckshot, they sure as heck thought something of it then. Half the mining company's guards were off duty, either sleeping in the bunkhouse or drinking in the canteen. But when they heard how a bunch of miners had suddenly and unexpectedly started attacking their fellow workers and had even managed to overpower the on-duty guards, they grabbed their guns and ran up the mountain to assist them. As more and more miners came limping down the mountain, the families living in Carson began tending to the wounded as best they could. They waited for the guards to come back, having put down the men responsible for starting the riot. But just like Jed said, it was no ordinary riot. When the gunfire finally stopped and no one came back down the mountain, some of Carson's menfolk ran up the slopes to see what had happened. But when they arrived, what they saw terrified them. Dead bodies were lying all around the mine's entrance. Some belonging to miners. Some belonging to guards. It made for a terrible scene. But it was nothing compared to what waited for them inside the mine. From the mine's entrance all the way down to its pit, the dead and dying lay side by side in puddles of each other's blood. Jed was told that in some sections the blood ran down the shaft in little rivers as pools of it higher up began to overflow and run down the passageways. There must have been at least 100 dead miners, and another 50 on death's door. As fast as they could, Carson's men began carrying the wounded out of the cave to be treated by the camp's doctor. And Jed said that he was told how awful the wounds were. Some men had been shot point blank with 12-gauge shotguns, meaning whole limbs had been blown off. In other cases, whole torsos had been torn open and shredded. But the wounds inflicted by pickaxes were just as gruesome. Some men were completely impaled, handles hanging from their fronts with the point of pickaxes emerging from their backs. Others had their skulls annihilated. In some cases, a dead man's only wound was a gaping hole in the top of his skull. It was a bloodbath. the worst thing any of Carson's men had ever seen. And they'd lived through Rocky Mountain winters, bear attacks, and outlaw raids. But nothing like this. Miners were dying just because they couldn't get help fast enough. The men would carry them out, and they'd seem in pain, but otherwise fine. Then, when they got back to them after seeing to those who were more severely wounded, the men had bled to death. It was awful. But the killing wasn't over. Not yet. As the men were clearing out the wounded, they had to go deeper and deeper into the mine. At one point, the son of the town butcher went running down into the mine to get some help. But he never came back. When his father went down to look for him, he found this boy with a pickaxe in his hands. He was hacking up corpses, so furiously that he was completely covered in their blood. His father tried to stop him, but the boy attacked him. No matter how much his father tried, the boy wouldn't stop. And in the end, the butcher had to put his own son down to keep him from hurting anyone else. He came out of that mine screaming and insane with grief. That's when they decided to seal the place up. After gathering up as much dynamite as they could, the walking wounded were able to blow the entrance and bury both the dead and the wounded alike. Some rumors say that seeing all that death made the boy go crazy, that his mind just couldn't handle it, and it slipped away from him as he walked among the dead with the coppery stink of fresh blood in the air. But those that were there, they say that there was something down there. Maybe some kind of gas, or fungal spore. Something to blame for making some of the miners turn on their comrades. It happened to the butcher's boy, and he himself got a dose when he was down there to look for his son, because all he could do was scream and cry and struggle as his friends and family tried to keep him still. He wasn't just out of his mind with the grief. There was something else affecting him, something the survivors thought best to bury. Jed said the mining company paid to have all the bodies collected in return, but they fired the survivors and tried to have them imprisoned for blowing their mine sky high. The company thought they got everybody's body off that mountainside, but Jed said that he knew of people who had found bones in the woods below the mine. Not animal bones either. Human bones. He actually asked if we wanted to go look for ourselves. He said there was a slim chance that we might even find a souvenir, as he put it. But we told him we were good. We had seen all we needed to. If there was anywhere on Earth that was genuinely haunted, it was that old mining town. And we didn't want any of those old ghosts putting a curse on our tour because we'd been dumb enough to go off with some of those bones. Jed laughed at that. And we did too. But it wasn't entirely a joke. Not in my case, anyway. We called it quits not long after. We were back on the road and headed for Aspen. We had Lake City and Carson in our rear view. But Jed's story stuck with me for the whole rest of the tour. It stuck with me so much that when we got back home, I rented a book from the Boston Library about mining disasters. It made for an obviously terrifying read. And I learned that there's a gas called hydrogen sulfide. It's something miners called stink damp. It is known to have a narcotic effect in certain doses. It is possible that the men at the mine's deepest point were suddenly exposed to high levels of the stink damp, at which point they lost their minds. The rest of the massacre could be explained by a kind of herd mentality, or collective panic whereby confused and frightened men were gripped by a sort of primal kill or be killed mentality. But the thing I've never been able to figure out is why the guards turned on each other too. Jed said it appeared as if the company guards, the ones who'd been off duty and stationed in town, had begun attacking each other during the final stages of the massacre. And to me, that suggests something other than narcotic gases was to blame for what had happened. I've often wondered what the real cause was. But there also comes a point where I tell myself to stop thinking about it, because the things my imagination starts to dream up can really start to frighten me. History leaves marks on the land. A collapsed mine. A rusted car. But sometimes, the wilderness hides things that are much more personal. Bones. Remnants. Evidence that civilization is just a thin veneer. And when you peel it back, you find that some people don't just survive in the wild. They feed on it. And sometimes, they feed on each other. Story 4, The Bone Broth. One morning, way back in October of 2007, a retired day hiker was trekking up the North Lateral Moraine Trail. He came across a shallow karst cave system just off the beaten path. He claimed to have an interest in what he called pioneer relics. Things like rusted tin cans and shattered crockery left behind from the old covered wagons that used to snake through the Front Range. So, he made a habit of shining his flashlight into the darkness and looking around for old artifacts. But what he found that day was no antique. He found bones. Human bones. He said that they were scattered around the cave floor and looked old, bleached, and white. He thought that they were just animal bones at first. But then, he found the skull. He told the dispatcher that he realized that it was a skeleton. Maybe one left over from the Donner Party, or at least some other tragedy of the sea type situation. He said they looked 100 years old. But he was wrong. And the person that proved him wrong was me. Whenever anyone finds human remains, and they're not fresh, medical examiners like me get a call. It's our job to head out to wherever the remains are found and give our expert opinion on how and why their owner passed away. Most of the time, we just simply drive over to the location of the remains and then drive back to the office once we're done. But on this occasion, since the remains were found way up in the Rockies, we were flying in by helicopter. We arrived around midday. Myself, a tech from the CBI lab in Greeley, a photographer from the coroner's office, and a couple of rangers from the Park Service to keep the area secure. It took a while, but we eventually found the cave the hiker had referred to. It was more like a crack in the granite. We suited up in these Tyvek suits, those sort of white suits that you see in CSI, and then we flicked on our headlamps and entered the cave to lay out the 10x10 meter baseline. Now, what struck me initially was that the remains were partial, meaning that it wasn't a complete skeleton. We found things like a detached mandible, fragments of a radius and ulna pair, a scattering of phalanges and thoracic vertebrae, but there was no pelvis. And neither were there any long bones below the femur, the thigh bones, which were also absent. Now, the hiker was right about the bones to an extent, because they appeared to have been there for a very long time. Under the light of my LED beams, I could see fine vertical striations that marred the cortical bone. This suggested decades of exposure to freezing winds. But then, the more I looked at it, the more something started to nag at me. When we found the skull, I took a good, long look at it. I was looking for gnaw marks from rodents, or other tooth marks which we call carnivore pitting from large predators. But there was nothing. There was uniform periosteal stripping, which was way too clean to be weather damage. and this left only one plausible explanation. The flesh had been cut away from the bone by something very sharp. Now, I bagged a sample right there. A shard of bone used for our preliminary histology, which is the fancy term for putting something under a microscope. Once we had a mobile unit set up at the trailhead, we ran the sample under the portable FTIR spectrometer, and then watched it as it lit up like a flare. There was a high amount of hydroxyapatite crystallinity, but the sample also exhibited some unusual thermal degradation signatures. To me, this indicated sublethal heating at a temperature of around 170 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no charring, and what we were looking at wasn't any kind of regular diagenesis or decomposition, and that left only one feasible explanation. The bones had been boiled. After returning to the cave and continuing our analysis, more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. We found a well-used enameled iron cooking pot at the rear of the cave. Traces of bone marrow residue clung to its interior. Its lipid profiles were consistent with the same kind that comes from human femurs. High in oleic acid, low in polyunsaturated fats. The discovery of more bones proved that the defleshing had been anything but crude scavenging. It had been methodical. There were parallel incision marks on the ends of the bones. Judging by the microstriations, they'd been inflicted by some kind of carbon steel filleting knife, most likely complete with a serrated edge. And to the best of my judgment, I'd have to say the flesh had been removed immediately after death, before the bones were simmered to make a broth of tenderized marrow. There would be no logical reason to do this other than consumption, in which case it made sense that the lower limbs were missing, as the medius cuts had most likely been hauled away for later. Now, in plain English, this wasn't the kind of survival cannibalism people were forced into on the Oregon Trail. This wasn't starvation. It had been staged in isolation, most likely to evade the prying eyes of rangers and hikers. This wasn't desperation. This was a feast. We had the remains airlifted to the Denver lab that afternoon, where a full post-mortem unfolded over the course of several weeks. Now, it took a while. But we heard the carbon dating on the sample we took pegged the year of death between 2003 and 2005. There were no corresponding dental records for the teeth that remained in the skull. The molars showed moderate damage, but there were no fillings or orthodontic work done. So my best guess involved the victim being some kind of vagrant. We extracted some degraded DNA and then ran it through the state's database, as well as CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. We got 0 hits. There were no familial matches. No cold case crossovers. Nothing. In terms of where the victim was from, enamel analysis hinted at a Midwestern upbringing. But in contrast to my theory that this person was a vagrant, the only thing that came up in the toxicology reports was trace caffeine metabolites. There was no indication of a struggle. No restraint artifacts on the wrists. The cause of death was most likely asphyxiation or blunt force. Executed elsewhere, then transported to the karst cave for what I guess you might call the harvest. The case files have been archived for more than 6 years now, gathering digital dust in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's unsolved ledger. Now, the killer, who was most likely male, considering the brute force required to do what he did. Clean slipped the noose, so to speak, meaning somewhere out there, in the sprawl of flyover country, or maybe in some tiny mountain town, a murderer and a cannibal is breathing free air. I used to imagine it sometimes. His pot was bubbling over with bone broth as he packaged up the better cuts. I can't forget it, and I know I never will. Because in this line of work, some fractures never heal. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark heart of the wilderness. The mountains are beautiful, but they keep their secrets well. Whether it's a hiker climbing impossible cliffs, a lover with a dark past, a ghost town massacre, or a cave that served as a kitchen, the wild is watching. If you have a story from the woods, a close encounter, or something you can't explain, email it to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. I want to hear what haunts you. And if you enjoyed this episode, please follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with a friend who thinks they're brave enough to hike alone. Until next time, stay on the trail and don't look back.